Welcome to Rose Revenge. I hope you're all staying warm today. How is the weather where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. A dirty napkin, a misnamed child, and a slap in the face. That was a woman's Christmas gift. They thought she was the weak link until a single business card fell out of a pocket, turning their perfect world into a house of cards. Let's hear Evelyn's story. I had just spent 6 hours fighting a lethal Pennsylvania blizzard, white-knuckling my steering wheel while my 4-year-old daughter slept in the back, only to have my mother look at me like I was something she had found on the bottom of her shoe. I did not even have the engine turned off before Margaret was standing on the porch, not with a blanket or a warm greeting, but with a face like thunder because my mud-splattered Subaru was ruining the aesthetic of her pristine, snow-covered driveway. "Evelyn, use the service entrance in the back," she shouted through the freezing wind, her voice dripping with that familiar, sharp-edged condescension. "I just had the Persian rugs in the foyer steam cleaned for our important guest tonight, and I won't have you and that child dragging in the slush." I felt a weary, familiar ache settle into my bones, a weight heavier than the 60-hour work weeks I put in managing a $200 million research fund in Philadelphia. To the world, I was a 33-year-old PhD in molecular biology, a woman who decided where millions of dollars in life-saving grants were allocated. To Margaret, I was just a failed single mother who could not even keep a car clean or a husband around. I carried Maya through the mudroom, my boots heavy and my spirit damp, only to be met by my mother in the kitchen. She did not hug me. She did not ask if we had survived the ice on the turnpike. Instead, she adjusted her silk scarf and looked at my exhausted face with a sigh of practiced disappointment. "You look haggard, Evelyn. It is truly a pity you chose this frantic lifestyle over a stable home," she said, her tone suggesting that my career was some sort of embarrassing hobby. "Tonight is not about you. Audrey's new beau, Julian Thorne, is coming. He is a brilliant doctor, the kind of success this family actually prides itself on. And I will not have you making things awkward with your situation." I stood there in the silence of the abyss, letting her words wash over me without a fight. My mother's world was one of appearances, of shiny surfaces and empty prestige, and in her eyes, I was a crack in the porcelain. She moved with a rigid, cold grace toward the dining room, and I followed her, expecting to see a place set for me and my daughter. The dining room was a masterpiece of suburban arrogance, the massive mahogany table shimmering under the crystal chandelier. It was set with the finest Lenox porcelain and sterling silver, glowing with the warmth of a Christmas I had dreamed of during the long, terrifying drive. There were 5 chairs, one for Margaret, one for my sister Audrey, and 3 for the important guests. My heart sank when I realized my name was nowhere near that mahogany. Margaret pointed a manicured finger toward the far corner of the kitchen, tucked away near the trash can and the drafty back door. There sat a wobbly $10 plastic card table covered in a cheap, stained paper tablecloth from the grocery store. 2 mismatched folding chairs were tucked beneath it, looking pathetic in the shadow of the grand feast. "Since you chose to be a single mother, Evelyn, you should be used to making sacrifices for the sake of the family's image," she said, her voice as cold as the ice on my windshield. "You and Maya will sit here at the children's table. I cannot have you distracting Julian with your complications while he is trying to enjoy a proper holiday meal." I looked from the plastic table to the Lenox porcelain, a bitter, ironic smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. My mother was so busy shielding her golden boy from the embarrassment of a single mother that she had no idea she was about to serve dinner to the woman who held his entire future in her hands. I was still standing by that wobbly plastic table, the cheap paper cover crinkling under my hand, when the doorbell rang. A sharp, melodic chime that seemed to mock the heavy silence of the kitchen. Margaret's face transformed instantly, the cold scowl she reserved for me melting into a radiant, sycophantic smile that I hadn't seen in years. She practically floated toward the foyer, her heels clicking a rhythmic, joyful tune on the hardwood floors she had just forbidden me to touch. "They're here!" she chirped, her voice hitting a high, performative note meant for the neighbors to hear. I stayed in the shadows of the kitchen, watching through the archway as my sister, Audrey, swept in, wrapped in a coat that probably cost more than my first car, followed closely by the man of the hour. Julian Thorne stepped into the light like he was walking onto a stage, radiating the kind of effortless, expensive confidence that only comes from never having been told no. He was exactly what Margaret craved, tall, polished, and carrying a bottle of vintage wine like it was a trophy. Margaret was already gushing before he even had his coat off, her hands fluttering around him as if he were royalty. "Julian, dear, we are so honored to have you. Audrey hasn't stopped talking about the incredible work you're doing. A true savior of modern medicine," she exclaimed, her voice thick with a pride she had never once extended to my doctorate or my research. Julian beamed, basking in the adoration with a practiced humility that made my skin crawl. He looked like the poster boy for the American dream. The successful doctor, the perfect partner, the golden future. But as Audrey led him toward the living room, his wandering gaze drifted past the grand mahogany table and landed straight on me, standing there in my wrinkled travel clothes by the trash can. For a split second, the polished mask slipped. His eyes widened, his tanned face went a shade paler, and the charismatic smile frozen on his lips looked suddenly like a grimace of pure terror. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with a realization that only the two of us shared. I didn't say a word. I simply watched him, my expression a mask of the silence of the abyss. In my mind, I wasn't in a drafty kitchen in Lancaster. I was back in my office in Philadelphia, staring at the 14 priority emails this man had sent me in the last week alone. I remembered the way he had begged for a meeting, the way he had tried to charm his way into my good graces through LinkedIn, desperate for me to sign off on his failing research project. He didn't know I was Audrey's sister, and I certainly hadn't realized that the pathetic, social climbing researcher hounding my assistant was the golden boy my mother had been worshiping. Julian took a sharp, jagged breath, his fingers tightening around the neck of the wine bottle as he tried to regain his footing. Margaret, oblivious to the silent earthquake happening in her foyer, stepped between us, her hand resting protectively on Julian's arm. "Oh, Julian, don't mind her," she said, her voice dropping into that patronizing, hushed tone she used when discussing a family shame. "That's just my eldest, Evelyn. She's between things, I suppose. She works in a lab over in Philly." Julian cleared his throat, the color slowly returning to his face as he realized I hadn't exposed him yet. He straightened his silk tie, his eyes narrowing as he decided to go on the offensive, choosing the coward's path of gaslighting me in my own mother's house. "Evelyn, right," he said, his voice regaining its oily smoothness, though it lacked its previous warmth. "I think I recognize you now. You're an administrative assistant at the university lab, aren't you?" I believe I might have spoken to your supervisor once or twice." The sheer audacity of it was almost breathtaking. He was looking me right in the eye, pretending I was the help, hoping his lie would bury the truth before it could ruin his perfect evening. Audrey let out a small, "Oh, Julian, you're so observant. Evelyn has always been more of the behind-the-scenes type. Practical, but not exactly a leader." I felt the bite of their words, the way they were working together to shrink me down until I disappeared. I stood my ground, my heart thumping a steady, dangerous rhythm against my ribs, but I kept my face as still as stone. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell them that I didn't have a supervisor. I had a board of directors. I just watched him sweat, enjoying the way his eyes darted toward the door, looking for an escape that didn't exist. Julian sensed my silence as a weakness and decided to twist the knife, leaning into the narrative my mother had created for him. He gave me a look of feigned, lingering sympathy, the kind of look one gives a stray dog. "It must be hard, Evelyn, being divorced, raising a child on an assistant's salary. It's no wonder you look so tired," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "It's a lonely road, I'm sure, but at least your mother was kind enough to let you join us for the holiday, even if it is at the back table." He turned back to Margaret and Audrey, his confident facade fully restored, leading them toward the dining room with a triumphant smirk. I stayed in the kitchen, the echoes of his insults ringing in my ears, and looked down at my phone tucked in my pocket. Inside that phone were the receipts of his desperation, the proof of his deceit, and the power to end his career with a single tap. The golden boy thought he had won the first round, but he had no idea he had just walked into a trap of his own making. I sat down on the creaky folding chair, the plastic legs groaning under my weight, and watched Maya carefully scoop a tiny spoonful of cold mashed potatoes from her chipped plastic bowl. Across the room, the mahogany table was a symphony of clinking silver and forced laughter, a world away from our drafty little island in the corner. Margaret was leaning in, her eyes sparkling as she hung on Julian's every word, while Audrey preened like a peacock beside him. I felt like a ghost haunting my own childhood home, a specter of the failure they needed me to be so they could feel more successful. The air in the kitchen was heavy with the scent of a turkey I wasn't supposed to enjoy, and the cold draft from the back door that Margaret deemed good enough for a single mother and her child. As the Golden Trio laughed at some inside joke about a country club I was never invited to, my mind drifted back to the winter of my third year in the PhD program. I remembered sitting in a university library that smelled of old paper and desperation, my fingers numb from the lack of heat in my tiny studio apartment, while I balanced a toddler on my lap and a mountain of molecular data on my screen. I had been surviving on ramen noodles and sheer willpower, fueled by the American dream that told me if I worked hard enough, if I sacrificed every hour of sleep and every cent of my meager savings, I would eventually earn my place at the table. While I was skipping meals to afford Maya's pediatrician visits and working 3 teaching assistant jobs, Margaret was calling me to complain that Audrey's designer prom dress had a loose thread, or that the country club's holiday gala was simply exhausting to organize. There was never a check in the mail to help with my skyrocketing student loans, never an offer to babysit so I could finish my dissertation, and certainly no pride when I finally walked across that stage to receive my doctorate. To them, my struggle wasn't a testament to my strength. It was an embarrassing inconvenience that didn't fit their polished suburban family portrait. The memory of those years felt like a physical weight in my chest. The nights I spent crying over the heating bill, and the days I spent pretending I wasn't exhausted so Maya wouldn't see the cracks in my armor. I had built my career out of nothing but grit and a refusal to be the victim they expected me to be. I had climbed the ladder in a male-dominated field, navigating the treacherous waters of academic funding and corporate greed, until I was the one holding the $200 million checkbook. Yet here I was, 33 years old, sitting by a trash can because I didn't have a stable man to validate my existence in my mother's eyes. I watched Julian brag about his pioneering research, his voice booming with a confidence that was entirely unearned, and I realized that Margaret didn't care about the truth. She only cared about the theater of success. "Oh, and look at little Mary, is it?" Margaret's voice drifted over from the main table, her tone distracted and dismissive. She didn't even look over her shoulder as she mispronounced her own granddaughter's name, treating my daughter like an uncredited extra in her holiday movie. "She's being so quiet back there. Such a blessing she didn't inherit your loud personality, Evelyn." My grip tightened on my fork until my knuckles turned as white as the Lenox porcelain I wasn't allowed to touch. Misnaming my child was the final fracture in a relationship that had been crumbling for decades. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the legacy of dismissal she was already trying to pass down to Maya. I looked down at Maya, who was blissfully unaware of the insult, her face smudged with a bit of gravy and a tired, innocent smile. She was my investment of a lifetime, the reason I had endured the 60-hour weeks and the cold Philadelphia winters. I felt a slow, icy resolve harden in my gut. I wasn't doing this for revenge, and I wasn't doing it out of a petty need to be right. I was doing it for justice, for the years of being told I was less than, for the nights of hunger, and for the little girl sitting next to me who deserved to know that her mother was a giant among these hollow, golden statues. I reached into my pocket, feeling the cold, hard glass of my phone. It was more than a device. It was the repository of my true identity, the receipts of Julian's deceit, and the power to dismantle the fragile ego of every person at that mahogany table. The silence of the abyss was over. It was time for the truth to speak. I sat in the dim light of the kitchen, the wobbly plastic of the card table biting into my forearms, and looked through the archway at the man who was currently the center of my mother's universe. Julian was leaning back, his expensive watch catching the light as he gestured broadly, playing the part of the successful visionary to a captive audience. But in my mind, I wasn't seeing the charming doctor. I was seeing the blue light of my computer screen back in October, reading the first of many LinkedIn messages that had made my skin crawl. He had found my profile, the program director of the Vance Research Fund, and instead of leading with data or clinical outcomes, he had led with an oily compliment about my intelligence and mysterious beauty. He had sent 14 priority emails in a single week, each one more desperate and unprofessional than the last, culminating in a bold suggestion that we meet privately at a dimly lit bar in Center City to discuss the project over drinks. He had no idea that the woman he was trying to seduce over cocktails was the same haggard sister-in-law he was now mocking in front of his girlfriend. I had archived those messages with a sense of professional loathing, recognizing him instantly as the type of man who used his charisma to bypass the rigorous demands of science. I had kept my responses strictly professional, never once letting on that his flirtations were being logged as evidence of his glaring lack of ethics. It was a sickening irony to watch him now, draped in my mother's approval, knowing that he had spent the last 2 months trying to emotionally betray my sister before he even knew I had a place in her life. To him, women were just stepping stones to the $2 million grant he was so hungry for. The hypocrisy in the room was thick enough to choke on. At the main table, Julian raised his crystal glass, the vintage wine shimmering like liquid rubies in the candlelight. "To family," he said, his voice deep and resonant, projecting a sincerity that was entirely manufactured. "And to loyalty. In a world that is so often chaotic, it is a rare blessing to find a home that values tradition and the bonds of trust as much as this one does." My mother beamed, her eyes misty with a pride she had never granted me, while Audrey looked at him with a sickeningly sweet devotion that made my stomach turn. They were all toasting to a lie, celebrating a man who was actively trying to undermine the very values they were praising. I felt the weight of my phone in my pocket again, a silent witness to the red flags that were currently being hidden behind a silk tie and a polished grin. Julian thought he was the hunter in this scenario, the clever climber who had secured both a beautiful girlfriend and a prestigious family connection. But he had failed to realize that he had been leaving a digital trail of breadcrumbs straight to my door for months. Every laugh he shared with my mother, every smug look he threw toward my children's table, only added another layer to the tower of cards I was about to knock down. I wasn't just a researcher. I was a student of human behavior, and Julian Thorne was a textbook case of a man who believed his own hype. As he leaned in to whisper something into Audrey's ear, the red flags weren't just in plain sight. They were waving like a warning flare in the middle of a storm. The clinking of silverware against fine bone china sounded like tiny, sharp hammers in the quiet air of the dining room, a stark contrast to the hollow silence at my plastic card table. I watched through the archway as Margaret leaned toward Julian, her face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, looking like a woman who had finally secured the social trophy she had been hunting for years. She took a delicate sip of wine before turning her gaze toward me, her eyes clouded with a performance of heavy maternal pity. "You know, Julian," Margaret began, her voice carrying easily across the distance to my corner, "it is truly a blessing to see a man with such a firm hand on his future. It is a lesson some people never learn until it is far too late. A woman alone in this world, without a provider or a sense of decorum, is like a ship without a rudder, destined to be battered by the waves of her own poor choices." She didn't have to say my name. The direction of her chin toward the kitchen trash can said everything she needed to say. Julian let out a low, appreciative, the sound of a man who was used to having his ego stroked by women who didn't know better. He reached out to pat Audrey's hand, though his eyes remained fixed on the grand mahogany surface, as if he already owned it. "You're absolutely right, Margaret," he said, his voice booming with an unearned authority that made my skin crawl. "Ambition is important, but it must be backed by the right connections. In fact, that is why I am so confident about the new year. My latest research project is on the verge of being awarded a $2 million grant from the Vance Research Fund. It is quite a prestigious honor, and I have been told by some very high-level contacts that my approval is practically a formality at this point." He leaned back, the image of a man who believed his own lies, completely unaware that the very person who had put his proposal in the rejection pending pile was currently eating cold potatoes 10 feet away. The irony was so sharp I could almost taste it. In my mind, I could see his application. It was a mess of vague data, inflated projections, and a glaring lack of transparency that had flagged it for a full audit weeks ago. I knew exactly why he was so desperate for that private meeting in Philadelphia. He wasn't looking for a collaborator. He was looking for a savior to bury his professional incompetence under a layer of charm. I stayed silent, maintaining my role as the invisible observer, watching the way he played my mother like a cheap fiddle, promising her a future of reflected glory that was built on a foundation of sand. I saw the way Audrey looked at him, with a desperate, wide-eyed hope that this man would finally be the one to elevate her status in our mother's eyes. And for a fleeting second, I felt a twinge of something that almost resembled pity. But then I remembered the 14 messages and the way he had just called me a lonely assistant to make himself feel tall. The tension in the room was a living thing, stretching tighter and tighter as Julian continued to babble about his innovative methods and his superior understanding of molecular biology. He was so caught up in the theater of his own success, so drunk on Margaret's sycophantic approval, that he became careless. He reached into his blazer pocket to pull out a silk handkerchief to dab at a drop of gravy on his chin, and as he did, his leather wallet caught on the lining of his coat. It tumbled onto the table, sliding across the polished mahogany with a dull thud before skidding off the edge. It hit the hardwood floor and flipped open, and a single crisp white business card slid out, spinning across the floor until it came to a rest right at the foot of my plastic table. I looked down at it, and even in the dim light of the kitchen, the bold, embossed letters of my own name and the title Program Director stared back at me like a loaded weapon. The small white rectangle of cardstock lay face up on the cold floor, its gold-embossed letters catching the dim light of the kitchen like a silent, glowing accusation. I stared at it for a heartbeat. My name, Evelyn Vance, Program Director, staring back at me from the linoleum. Before I could even move to pick it up, Julian was out of his chair at the mahogany table with a violent scrape of wood against the floor. His face had gone from a polished tan to a sickly, mottled gray, his eyes wide and vibrating with a frantic, cornered energy. He didn't wait for me to speak. He didn't even give me a chance to breathe. Instead, he launched into a defensive strike so aggressive it felt like a physical blow. "Evelyn, what on earth is wrong with you?" he barked, his voice hitting a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed off the high ceilings. He pointed a trembling finger at the card as if it were a weapon I had used to threaten him. "How did you get my private business card? Have you been going through my coat in the mudroom?" "Margaret, I tried to be polite, I really did, but I didn't realize your daughter was actually stalking me." The air in the room seemed to vanish as Julian's gaslighting reached its toxic peak. He turned to my mother and Audrey, his hands shaking as he wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, painting a picture of himself as the innocent victim of a desperate single mother who had become dangerously obsessed with the successful man who had entered her sister's life. "She's been watching me all night," Julian continued, his voice dripping with a manufactured, oily pity that made my skin crawl. "I saw her lurking in the shadows when we arrived. I assumed she was just lonely, given her situation. But this is a whole new level of instability. She probably took this card from my wallet while I was distracted by your wonderful hospitality." He was building a wall of lies, brick by brick, using my mother's own prejudices as the mortar to hold it together. He knew exactly which buttons to press, playing on Margaret's deep-seated fear of social embarrassment and her desire for a perfect family image. Margaret didn't ask to see the card. She didn't look at the name printed on it or ask for my side of the story. To her, the truth didn't matter nearly as much as the fact that the brilliant doctor who was supposed to be the family's crown jewel was being insulted. She crossed the kitchen in 3 swift, terrifying strides, her silk blouse whispering with a murderous intent that I had felt my entire life, but never seen so clearly. Without a word of warning, she swung her hand with a lifetime of pent-up resentment. The sound of her palm striking my cheek rang out like a gunshot in the silent house, a sharp, stinging crack that made Maya cry out in her sleep from the corner. My head snapped to the side, the force of the blow sending a shockwave of white-hot pain through my jaw and into my very soul. "You ungrateful, pathetic girl," Margaret hissed, her voice a low, vibrating growl of pure hatred. "How dare you humiliate this family? How dare you try to tear down a man like Julian because you're too bitter to handle your own failures? You are a disgrace to this house, and you will not ruin this night with your jealousy." In that moment, as the heat of the slap settled into a dull, throbbing ache, something inside me finally went quiet. An awakening that felt like an icy wave washing over a burning building. The invisible tether that had bound me to this woman's approval for 33 years didn't just fray. It snapped with a definitive, crystalline finality. The silence of the abyss took hold of me, but it wasn't a silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of a strategist who had just seen the enemy's final move. I felt a sudden, profound clarity so sharp it was almost blinding. This was the moment where the pain stopped being a burden and started being a weapon. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I certainly didn't beg for her forgiveness. I simply turned my head back to face her, the movement slow and deliberate, my eyes locking onto hers with a coldness that made her take a half step back in confusion. I reached up and slowly, calmly, wiped a tiny bead of blood from the corner of my lip with the back of my hand, looking at the red smudge as if it were a minor curiosity rather than a wound. The theater of the perfect family was over. And as Julian watched me from the safety of the mahogany table with wide, terrified eyes, he realized that by calling for blood, he had finally forced me to show him exactly what kind of power I was truly holding. Oh my God, I can't believe she just did that. A mother choosing a stranger's lies over her own daughter's face. Have you ever been in a situation where your family chose to believe a lie because it looked better on the outside? I'm so heartbroken for Evelyn right now. Please leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. Should Evelyn stay and fight or just walk away? And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you're rooting for her. The sting on my cheek was still pulsing, a rhythmic, white-hot reminder of the woman I was finally leaving behind. But I did not flinch. I reached down and picked up the card, my card, and held it between 2 fingers like a scalpel, the gold-embossed letters of the Vance Research Fund gleaming under the harsh kitchen light. The silence in the dining room was absolute, broken only by Julian's heavy, jagged breathing as he stood frozen at the mahogany table, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. I did not scream, and I did not raise my voice to match my mother's hysterical accusations. Instead, I leaned against the kitchen counter, my posture shifting from the slumped, disappointing daughter to the sharp, calculating strategist who had been observing this circus from the shadows. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen glowing in the dim light of the kitchen like a beacon of cold, hard truth. "Julian," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the room with a clinical precision that made him flinch, as if I had struck him. "You seem to have forgotten that I do not just work in a lab. I manage the very fund you have been hounding for 2 months. And since you have brought up the idea of stalking, perhaps we should look at the digital trail you have been leaving since October." I tapped the screen and hit the speakerphone icon, setting the device on the wobbly plastic table where my daughter still slept, blissfully unaware of the storm I was about to unleash. I did not engage in a petty argument. I simply let the evidence speak for itself. "Evelyn, I cannot stop thinking about our meeting in Philadelphia." The recording played, Julian's own voice filling the room with an oily, desperate charm that made Audrey's face go pale as a sheet. "I know the grant application is pending, and I am willing to do anything, and I mean anything, to get that approval. Let us meet at the Ritz Bar at 11 p.m. tonight, just the two of us." I scrolled to the next one, then the next, reading the dates and timestamps aloud with the cold detachment of a scientist reviewing a failed, contaminated experiment. October 22nd, November 14th, December 2nd, at 12:45 in the morning. Each message was a confession, a record of his willingness to trade his professional ethics and his supposed loyalty to my sister for a $2 million check. I took back my position as the true matriarch of my own life in that moment, watching the golden boy disintegrate in real time while I maintained the silence of the abyss. I was no longer the failed single mother sitting at the children's table. I was the woman who held the keys to his entire future. Audrey's wine glass shattered against the mahogany table, the red liquid spreading like a wound across the white tablecloth. But she did not even notice the mess. She looked at Julian, her eyes filled with a sudden, sharp clarity that no amount of gaslighting could ever blur again. Julian did not move or speak. He just stared at the phone as if it were a ticking bomb that had finally detonated in his face, his charismatic mask shattered into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces. He had gone from arrogant to terrified in the span of 60 seconds. Margaret looked from the phone to Julian, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, the reality of her savior's betrayal finally sinking through the thick, stubborn layers of her own vanity. She had been so desperate to protect her image that she had invited a predator to her table and slapped the daughter who was actually protecting her legacy. I felt a slow, icy satisfaction, a catharsis that had been 33 years in the making. I did not do this out of a petty need for revenge. I did it because justice required the truth to be heard in a house built on lies. The receipts were all there, laid out in chronological order, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding all the power. Julian Thorne was no longer a brilliant doctor. He was a desperate man whose career was bleeding out on my mother's kitchen floor. The air in the dining room was thick with the copper tang of my own blood and the suffocating scent of Julian's terror. But I did not flinch. I did not need to shout to be heard. The deadly composure was my most powerful ally now, a cold, clinical weapon forged in the years of being ignored. Julian stood there, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles looked like bleached bone, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. He tried to speak, to offer one last oily explanation or a desperate plea for mercy, but the words died in his throat like withered leaves. I looked at him, not with the heat of anger, but with the detached gaze of a scientist observing a specimen that had already failed its final test. "You see, Julian," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand, cutting through the silence of the abyss. "This was never about a personal grudge. This was always about the integrity of the research I represent. The Vance Research Fund has strict, ironclad regulations regarding what we call a conflict of interest. The moment I realized that the man hounding my professional inbox for a $2 million grant was the same man pretending to love my sister just to gain a family connection to the board, I had a legal and ethical obligation to act. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, the clicking of my heels on the hardwood floor sounding like the ticking of a clock counting down the final seconds of his career. I did not do this because I hate you, though you have given me every reason to. I did this because justice demanded it. I have already submitted a formal disclosure to the university's ethics committee and the board of directors at the foundation. I filed the report the very hour I confirmed your connection to my sister through her social media posts. The $2 million you were so certain of is no longer on the table. In fact, the board voted unanimously this afternoon to permanently blackball your name from any future funding. But it does not stop there. Because you attempted to use emotional manipulation and professional proximity as a leverage for financial gain, there is an official ethics investigation being launched into your medical license as we speak. You weren't just courting my sister, Julian. You were attempting to defraud a multi-million-dollar research institution, and I am the one who had to sign the papers to stop you. By the time the sun rises tomorrow, you will not just be without a grant. You will be without a career, and your name will be synonymous with professional suicide in every laboratory in Philadelphia. The transformation in Julian was total and pathetic. A complete collapse of the golden boy persona my mother had worshipped for the last few hours. The charismatic doctor, the savior of medicine, vanished entirely, replaced by a man who looked like he had aged 20 years in 30 seconds. His legs seemed to give out under the weight of his own greed, and he sank onto the floor, his expensive suit trousers crumpling against the wood as he quivered in the shadow of the grand feast. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and brimming with a sudden, watery fear. But I felt nothing. No pity, no regret. Only the profound relief of finally being free from the lies. Audrey let out a strangled sob, burying her face in her hands as she realized her perfect boyfriend was a fraud. While my mother stood frozen like a pillar of salt, her eyes darting between her ruined guest and the daughter she had just struck. The power dynamic in this house had shifted forever, and for the first time in 33 years, I was the one holding the sword. I looked at the broken man on the floor, and then at my mother, who could no longer meet my gaze. The mahogany table, the Lenox porcelain, the expensive wine, it all looked like trash now, a stage set for a play that had just been canceled. Julian Thorne was finished, and the silence that followed was the sound of my own rebirth. The silence that followed Julian's collapse was heavier than the blizzard outside, a suffocating stillness that made the grand dining room feel like a mausoleum for a future that was never meant to be. I turned my gaze away from the broken man on the floor and looked directly into my mother's eyes, using the cold, clinical composure I had honed through years of professional scrutiny. Margaret's face was a pale mask of shock, her hands still trembling from the force of the slap she had given me. But I felt no need to scream or demand an apology. "Mother, look at him," I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through her fading arrogance with a sharp, but not rude, precision. "You were so desperate for a savior to fix this family's image that you chose to ignore the rot right in front of you." I walked toward the mahogany table, my fingers trailing over the edge of the fine Lenox porcelain she prized so much, the cold surface feeling like ice against my skin. "You spent so much time polishing these plates and worrying about the Persian rugs, yet you let a predator sit at your right hand because he had the right title and the right watch." I saw her flinch, the first crack appearing in her rigid, silver-haired armor, as she realized the daughter she had relegated to the children's table was the only one who had seen the truth. The most painful part was not the physical blow, but the realization that my mother's betrayal went far deeper than a single night of violence. I looked at her, and I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes when I mentioned the messages. "I know you saw them, Mother," I whispered, the silence of the abyss finally giving way to a devastating truth. "I saw the way you glanced at Audrey's phone 2 weeks ago when a notification from Julian popped up. I saw the way you quickly looked away and encouraged her to buy that expensive dress for tonight anyway. You knew he was a good doctor on paper, and to you, that was worth more than your daughter's dignity or your other daughter's heart. You chose the theater of success over the reality of our safety, and you were willing to sacrifice me as the failed single mother just to keep the play running." Margaret tried to speak, her lips parting as if to offer a defense of tradition or family values, but I simply held up a hand to silence her. As I stood there, I thought about the hard work and self-reliance that had actually built my life. The 60-hour weeks and the nights spent studying by the light of a flickering lamp while Maya slept. That was the real American dream, the one based on labor and truth, not the hollow facade my mother had been maintaining with her Lenox china and sterling silver. I felt a profound sense of liberation, a rebirth that I had never expected to find in this cold, judgmental house. I realized that I no longer needed her forgiveness, her approval, or her love to validate the woman I had become. My 33 years of striving to be enough for her ended right there, amidst the shattered wine glass and the smell of roasted turkey that had turned to ash in my mouth. I did not hate her. Instead, I felt a quiet, clinical pity for a woman who lived in a house so grand, yet so utterly empty of genuine connection. This was the healing moment, the psychological therapy for the years of being told I was a disappointment. I turned away from the mahogany table and the porcelain that was now just cold clay in my eyes, moving back toward the kitchen corner where the wobbly plastic table stood. Julian was still a heap on the floor, and Audrey was a shadow of herself. But I could no longer find the energy to care about their ruin. I picked up Maya's small, tattered bunny from the floor and began to quietly gather her things, my movements purposeful and calm. The sounds of the house, the ticking clock, the distant wind, the soft whimpering of my sister, felt like they belonged to a different life. I was no longer a ghost in this house. I was a woman leaving a graveyard. I looked at my sleeping daughter, her face peaceful despite the storm, and I knew that her life would never be defined by the plastic table in the corner. We were leaving the cold welcome behind, moving toward a future where our worth was not a formality to be approved by a hollow matriarch. I did not wait for an apology that I knew would never come, nor did I look back at the ruin of the dinner party as I hoisted Maya into my arms. She was heavy with the deep, trusting sleep of a child who knew she was safe because I was there. And as her head settled against my shoulder, I felt the final fragments of my old life fall away like dead leaves in a storm. I walked through the mudroom one last time, ignoring the expensive wreaths and the polished surfaces that had always felt like a cage. When I pushed open the back door, the freezing air did not feel like an enemy anymore. It felt like a reset, a sharp and bracing reminder that I was still alive and entirely whole. The blizzard that had nearly driven me off the road 6 hours ago had finally quieted into a soft, rhythmic hush, leaving the world blanketed in a layer of white that looked like a clean, unwritten page. There were no more voices shouting about decorum or status, only the sound of my own boots crunching firmly into the fresh snow as I made my way to the car. I settled Maya into her car seat, tucking her tattered bunny beside her and kissing her forehead, feeling a surge of protective love that Margaret would never understand. My old Subaru was still covered in the gray slush of the turnpike, looking rugged and out of place in the pristine driveway. But as I gripped the steering wheel, it felt like the most luxurious vehicle in the world, because it was mine, earned through my own labor and my own persistence. I backed out of the driveway without a single glance at the colonial house glowing with its hollow amber light. I could see the silhouette of my mother standing by the window, a lonely figure framed by the very perfection she had used to alienate her own flesh and blood. But I did not stop. I shifted into drive and turned the nose of the car toward Philadelphia, toward the life I had built with my own 2 hands. The drive back was a different journey entirely. The road was empty and silent, the moonlight reflecting off the snow-covered fields of Lancaster County in a way that felt peaceful rather than isolating. I thought about my apartment in the city, with its mismatched furniture and the tall windows that looked out over the skyline, and I realized that was where the warmth truly was. It was a place where my doctorate was respected, where my daughter was loved by name, and where I didn't have to sit at a plastic table to prove my worth. The ultimate freedom, I felt, was not just about leaving a house. It was about leaving the need for their validation. I realized that the road ahead might be cold and the 60-hour work weeks would still be waiting for me. But for the first time in 33 years, the path belonged entirely to me. As the lights of the city began to shimmer on the horizon, I felt a profound sense of healing language wash over me. I was no longer the daughter, the sister, or the failed single mother. I was Evelyn Vance, a woman who had protected her child, her career, and her soul in a single night. The silence in the car was not the heavy, suffocating silence of the abyss I had lived in for so long. It was the quiet confidence of a survivor who had finally found her way home. I looked at Maya in the rearview mirror and whispered a promise to her, that she would never have to earn her place at a table in my house. The storm was behind us now, and as the car glided over the bridge and into the heart of Philadelphia, I knew that the morning sun would find us exactly where we were meant to be. 1 month had passed since that winter night in Lancaster, and the chill of the blizzard had finally been replaced by the quiet, steady warmth of a Philadelphia spring. Justice, as it turns out, does not always need to be a loud explosion. Sometimes, it is simply the sound of the truth settling into place. Julian Thorne was no longer the golden boy of the medical world. His suspension from the university was immediate, and his reputation in the scientific community had evaporated overnight as the ethics board began its deep dive into his fraudulent behavior. He was a man who had tried to build a kingdom on a foundation of lies, only to find himself buried under the weight of his own greed. Audrey had moved away to another state, seeking a fresh start where no one knew the story of her disgraced fiancé. And my mother, Margaret, remained in her grand colonial house, surrounded by her polished silver and her perfect porcelain. But the silence there was now absolute. She had finally achieved the pristine, undisturbed life she always wanted. But she was learning the hard way that a house without the messy, honest presence of family is nothing more than a very expensive museum. I, however, was no longer looking back. I stood backstage at the National Cancer Conference, the hum of hundreds of professionals filling the air as I prepared to take my place as the keynote speaker. My work had been recognized not just for its complexity, but for its integrity, and I was being celebrated for the very expertise that my mother had once dismissed as a frantic hobby. As I stepped onto that stage, bathed in the bright light of a future I had built for myself, I did not feel a need for revenge or even an apology. I felt only the profound, settling peace of a woman who had finally found her true worth. My life was no longer about the theater of success or the approval of a hollow matriarch. It was about the truth of the labor I did and the love I had for my daughter. I had walked away from the children's table and found my place at the head of my own life, and I knew that from this day forward, the only person I ever needed to prove anything to was the woman staring back at me in the mirror. That was Evelyn's journey. It's hard to watch someone we love be so blind to our worth, but sometimes the only way to find your light is to leave the room that keeps you in the dark. I personally felt that slap in my soul. But seeing Evelyn stand up with such grace and professional power reminded me that our hard work and integrity are our greatest shields. To all the women listening who have ever felt like the failure of the family, remember, you are the CEO of your own life. What do you think was the most powerful moment? Was it the reveal of the messages, or the moment Evelyn walked out that door? And what is the biggest lesson you took from today's story? I'd love to read your reflections in the comments below. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Stay strong, stay graceful. This is Lucy May, signing off.